Cops storm woman's home while she bathes, then panic when they learn she's FBI director's daughter. On a Sunday evening, Aisha Carter was finally at peace after a long and busy week. She had been working non-stop at her new job, and her body begged for rest. She decided to treat herself with a long bath. The apartment was warm, the lights were dim, and she put her phone on silent mode so she wouldn't be disturbed. The water was hot, and steam floated gently in the bathroom, giving her a sense of calm. She sank into the tub, closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, she let go of all the stress that had been pressing down on her shoulders. But outside her apartment, a very different story was unfolding. On the same floor, a neighbor had been in a heated phone argument. During the fight, the neighbor accidentally pressed a number that triggered an emergency call. The dispatcher on duty logged the location incorrectly, noting Aisha's unit instead of the neighbor's. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars rushed to the apartment building. The officers believed there might be a dangerous situation or someone in need of urgent help. When they arrived, they knocked firmly on Aisha's door. "Police! Open up," they called out. Inside the bathroom, Aisha barely heard anything over the sound of running water. At first, she thought it was a faint noise from outside, maybe kids running in the hallway. She ignored it. The officers knocked again, louder this time. They called her name after checking the mailbox label outside. Still, there was no answer. The senior officer grew concerned. The water sound was constant, and nobody was coming to the door. He worried that someone inside might be unconscious or hurt in the tub. The team began preparing to force entry, convinced they were responding to a real emergency. At that exact moment, Aisha finally caught the sound of heavy knocks mixed with voices. Startled, she sat up quickly, water spilling over the edge of the tub. Wrapping a towel around herself, she shouted, "Who's there?" Her voice echoed, but it only made the officers more alert. To them, it sounded like a weak or frightened voice, a possible victim. Without waiting much longer, one officer tried the lock and announced loudly, "We're coming in to help." The door cracked open after a forced push. Heavy boots moved across her living room floor. Aisha, shocked, stepped out of the bathroom doorway clutching her towel tighter around her. She froze, her heart racing, as she saw 3 officers standing inside her home. The scene became tense in an instant. Aisha felt exposed and confused. She shouted, "What are you doing here? This is my house." Her voice trembled, both from fear and disbelief. The officers, equally stunned to find her like this, hesitated. They weren't expecting to see a young woman straight out of a bath, frightened and cornered. The senior officer raised his hands to calm the situation. "Ma'am, please, stay calm. We received an emergency call linked to this address. We need to make sure you're safe." His words were firm but careful, trying to balance authority with reassurance. Aisha's mind spun. She had not called anyone, and she was certain nothing had happened that should bring the police. Still clutching her towel, she stepped back a little. The female officer in the group quickly moved forward, gently asking Aisha to sit down and cover herself more comfortably. She spoke in a softer tone, unlike the sharp commands from the others. "It's okay, you're not in trouble. Let's figure this out together," she said. Aisha, shaking and embarrassed, managed to wrap a robe over her towel. Her hands were trembling as she tied the belt around her waist. Her face burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. Strangers had stormed her private space while she was bathing, and she couldn't understand why. The officers began scanning the room, looking for any signs of distress or danger. They saw nothing unusual, just a tidy apartment, warm steam coming from the bathroom, and a young woman who clearly was not in need of rescue. The senior officer's expression shifted. Something about the situation wasn't adding up. He turned back to his radio and contacted dispatch. "Confirm the original caller's address, he said in a sharp tone. After a long pause, the dispatcher hesitated and admitted there might have been a mistake with the apartment number. The officer pressed for details, but the answer was uncertain. By now, Aisha was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. She asked, "Do you understand what you've just done? You broke into my home while I was bathing. I didn't call you." Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from the weight of shock. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this could turn into something far more serious. They hadn't expected such a misunderstanding, and certainly not in this way. The female officer tried to calm things further, offering Aisha a glass of water from her own kitchen and suggesting she sit on the couch. But the atmosphere in the room remained thick with tension. Aisha, still confused, asked for her phone. She wanted to call someone she trusted to help her sort this out. The senior officer, though uncomfortable, allowed it. "Go ahead, ma'am. We just need to clear this up." What they didn't realize was that Aisha had a contact card tucked safely in her phone for emergencies, given to her by her family. That single call would change the entire situation and make the officers realize they had just stepped into something far bigger than a routine welfare check. The night that began with warm water and quiet peace had suddenly turned into a scene of flashing badges, confusion, and fear. But for the officers, the real shock was yet to come. Aisha stood in the middle of her living room, one hand holding her robe closed, the other trying to steady her breathing. Her heart beat fast from the shock. She had been enjoying a quiet bath, and now there were officers in boots and uniforms inside her home. The sound of dripping water from the bathroom felt strange and loud in the stillness. It reminded her how quickly peace can break. She swallowed hard and tried to speak, but her throat felt tight. The female officer gave her a soft nod, a small sign that she could take her time. The senior officer raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. His voice was calm. He explained again that they were responding to an emergency call. He added that the sound of running water worried them. They thought someone might be hurt. Aisha listened, but her face showed pain and confusion. She had not asked for help. She had not called anyone. She wanted her space and her dignity back. She took a slow breath and asked, in a steady but quiet voice, if she could please sit down. The female officer looked to her team and then guided Aisha to the couch. She asked if Aisha wanted a blanket or water. Aisha nodded yes to the blanket. The female officer picked up a throw from the armchair and draped it carefully over Aisha's shoulders, making sure it covered the robe. Little by little, Aisha felt less exposed. She thanked the officer softly, the words barely more than a whisper. The senior officer asked if there was anyone else in the apartment. Aisha shook her head. She said she lived alone and had been in the bath for the last 20 minutes. The senior officer spoke into his radio and asked dispatch to confirm the original caller's number and apartment. The radio crackled. There was a long pause. He asked again, slower, repeating the building address and floor. Another pause. Aisha watched his face. She could read the uncertainty there. He was no longer sure they had the right place. The female officer stayed near Aisha, keeping her focus on her comfort rather than on the open door or the hallway, which still felt like a stage for anyone to see. Aisha asked them, politely but firmly, to please step away from the bathroom door. She wanted to close the door and turn off the water. The senior officer agreed right away and motioned for his team to back up. The female officer walked with Aisha, keeping her body between Aisha and the open living room so that Aisha felt less on display. Aisha turned off the tap, pulled the shower curtain fully closed, and latched the bathroom door. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet. She could still feel the warm steam on her cheeks. It helped calm her a little. When she came back to the living room, she felt steadier. She told the officers she had a driver's license in her purse on the entry table. The female officer offered to bring the purse over so Aisha wouldn't have to move around too much. Aisha gave a nod. The purse was placed on the coffee table, and Aisha took out her wallet with slow, careful hands. She showed her license, her name, and the correct apartment number. She repeated that she had not called. Her voice grew stronger with each sentence, like someone slowly finding a light switch in a dark room. The senior officer studied the license and repeated Aisha's full name and address to dispatch. He asked for a timestamp of the original call, the callback number, and any notes that might explain the confusion. He requested a cross-check with the building directory. The radio crackled again. The dispatcher said the call might have come from the same floor but could have been logged wrong because the caller's words were unclear. The senior officer frowned. He knew that in a real emergency, a mistake like this could cost time. But in this case, the cost was a person's peace, dignity, and sense of safety inside her own home. "I'm sorry for the shock," he said to Aisha, and he meant it. "We still need to make sure no one else is in danger in this building. May I have one officer step into the hallway and verify the neighbors are okay?" Aisha held his gaze. She understood the need to check, but she also needed to feel in control again. She nodded. "Yes, please do, but leave my door open only a little," she said. The senior officer agreed. He sent one officer to the hallway and kept his own stand several steps back from Aisha, clearly trying to reduce pressure. The female officer asked if Aisha wanted a glass of water. Aisha nodded. "Kitchen is to the left," she said. The female officer asked for permission to enter the kitchen, then filled a glass and placed it within Aisha's reach, not forcing it into her hands. That small act mattered. It was gentle. It gave Aisha space. Aisha took a sip. The water steadied her voice. She said, "I did not call. I was in the bath. I want to understand what led to this." The senior officer gave a short, respectful nod. "You deserve that," he replied. "We're working on the details now." From the hallway, the other officer reported that the corridor was quiet. No signs of distress. Doors closed. The senior officer asked him to check the unit across the hall and to speak softly if anyone answered. He did not want to make the situation bigger or louder than it already was. Aisha listened to the quiet hallway sounds, the soft knock, the careful introduction, the calm exchange of words she could not fully hear. She imagined the neighbor's face opening the door, confused or tired, maybe surprised to see an officer this late. Aisha looked at the female officer and said, "May I use my phone?" The senior officer answered at once, "Yes, of course." Aisha reached for her phone on the side table. Her hands were steadier now. She unlocked the screen and saw several notifications from earlier, but none of them were relevant to this moment. She scrolled to a contact card labeled Family, Emergency. It was a number given to her with a simple instruction: if something serious ever happens, call this number, stay calm, and explain only what is necessary. Before she pressed the call button, she paused. She wanted to be fair. "I am going to make a call," she told the senior officer. "I will explain that officers entered my apartment because of an emergency call that might have been misdirected. I will also say you are cooperating now." The senior officer nodded. "That is accurate," he said. He kept his voice even and respectful. "Thank you for letting us know." She pressed the button. The line rang. Each ring seemed longer than a normal ring, as if time were stretching. The female officer looked down and gave Aisha her privacy, stepping back a little more. The living room felt calmer now. The door was half open to the hallway, letting in a thin line of cooler air. The sound of distant footsteps on the stairs floated in and then faded. The building was back to its quiet Sunday rhythm, except for this small pocket of tension. The call connected. Aisha heard a professional, steady voice introduce themselves and ask for her name. She gave it. She spoke clearly and simply, explaining the scene without adding blame or sharp words. She said the police were inside because of a wrong call. She said she was safe. She said she wanted the situation documented correctly and politely. The voice on the line asked a few simple questions: your address, your phone number, are officers still present, are you alone, are you safe? Aisha answered yes to safety, yes to being alone, yes to officers present. She kept her tone calm. Across the room, the senior officer spoke quietly into his radio again. He asked dispatch for a supervisor callback. He asked them to flag the incident as a possible address error. He requested that the original caller's number be checked and, if safe, called back for confirmation. He did not want to guess anymore. He wanted facts. He wanted a written record that explained the steps taken and the reason for entry. His posture was straighter now, as if he, too, needed to restore order by choosing careful words and clear actions. Aisha covered the mouthpiece and told the officers, the person on the line would like your badge number and your name, for the record. The senior officer gave both without hesitation. He also offered the call sign of his unit and the incident time. Aisha repeated them slowly, so the person on the phone could note them correctly. Then she listened. The voice on the line said they would reach out to the local watch commander to understand what happened and to ensure everything remained calm from this point forward. In the hallway, the officer who had gone to check the nearby unit returned. He spoke softly to his senior. There had been a misunderstanding earlier that evening, he said, but he did not yet have the full story. The senior officer nodded and told him to wait. He wanted to finish the conversation with dispatch and keep Aisha informed first. He turned to Aisha and said, "We are getting closer to the answer. We will make sure the details are right." Aisha thanked him for using a respectful tone. She asked, "May I change into fresh clothes while you wait in the hallway?" The senior officer agreed immediately. He told the team they would step outside and give her privacy. "Please take your time," he added. The female officer said she would remain just outside the door in case Aisha needed anything. Aisha nodded. It was a small but important moment. She felt heard. She felt a line of safety drawn again between her private space and the outside world. When the officers stepped into the hallway, the room felt different. The air seemed lighter. Aisha stood and walked to her bedroom. She closed the door gently and dressed in comfortable clothes. She brushed her hair, still damp from the bath, and took another deep breath in the quiet. The apartment, her safe place, felt like hers again. She picked up her phone from the bed, checked the time, and returned to the living room. The officers were waiting outside, speaking in low voices, careful not to crowd the doorway. Aisha opened the door and stood in the frame, the blanket still around her shoulders but her posture strong. She told the officers she was ready to continue. She said she appreciated the step back and the respectful approach. She also said she wanted a written explanation of why they entered, who made the call, and what would be done to prevent this in the future. The senior officer promised that a supervisor would come and that a report would be prepared. He did not sound defensive. He sounded like someone who knew the importance of getting this right. From down the hall came a soft sound, another apartment door closing, a quiet apology spoken to someone else. Aisha glanced that way but kept her focus on the conversation. She had not yet asked the question rising in her chest, the one about how such a mistake could happen and how often it might happen to others. She saved it. There would be time for that soon, when a higher-ranking person arrived and when the full story was known. For now, Aisha held on to the simple truth that steadied her: she was safe, she had been heard, and the next steps would be careful. Her phone rested in her hand, the recent call still in the log. She knew that what came next would bring clarity. She knew that one more call, one that was already in motion somewhere beyond this hallway, would change the tone in moments. She stood quietly, breathing evenly, ready to hear the full explanation and to make sure the record would reflect what truly happened inside her home. That the supervisor sat in Aisha's living room, his notepad balanced carefully on his knee. The weight of the mistake hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The officers who had first stormed in now stood quietly by the door, their shoulders tense, their eyes fixed on the floor. It was no longer the scene of authority they had walked in with, it was a moment of accountability. Aisha, wrapped in her blanket, leaned slightly forward on the couch. Her voice was calm, but each word carried power. She asked again why the address had not been double-checked before entry. The supervisor explained that in emergency calls, seconds can matter, and sometimes officers move too quickly when they believe someone might be in danger. But, he admitted, moving too quickly without confirmation can cause harm of its own. Tonight proved that. His honesty was not defensive, it was heavy with regret. Aisha's eyes did not soften. She said clearly, "Privacy is also safety. You came into my home while I was in the most vulnerable state. That can never happen again to me, or to anyone." The female officer lowered her head slightly, as if agreeing silently. The supervisor wrote notes and promised this incident would not be buried in silence. The senior officer shifted uneasily. His earlier confidence was gone. He had learned the truth of who Aisha was, and that truth weighed on him. He cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I want to apologize personally. We believed we were helping, but we caused you distress. We will make this right." His voice shook just slightly, betraying the pressure inside him. Aisha looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Apologies are a start, but what will change because of this? What system will stop this from repeating?" Her father's lessons echoed in her mind: never accept words without action. The supervisor straightened. He explained that new procedures would be added, a mandatory double verification of addresses in welfare checks, a requirement to attempt callbacks before entry, and a rule that a female officer must lead if a private space like a bathroom or bedroom was involved. "These steps will be reviewed by command this week," he said. As he spoke, Aisha's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. A secure message appeared: "We are aware. Remain calm. Report will follow." She knew it was from her father's aide. She tucked the phone beside her and returned her focus to the supervisor. The tension in the room shifted again when the neighbor, the one who had misdialed, appeared at the door. The younger officer had quietly gone to speak with him and now brought him forward. The neighbor's face was pale, guilt written all over it. He stammered, I didn't mean for this to happen. I was arguing on the phone, I pressed the wrong numbers. I didn't know they'd come here. I'm so sorry." Aisha's jaw tightened. She studied him for a moment, then asked, "Did you tell the dispatcher which apartment you were in?" The neighbor admitted he had, but his words were rushed and unclear, and in the confusion, the dispatcher marked the wrong unit. The supervisor sighed heavily. "So the error began with miscommunication and ended with us forcing entry where we should not have." His voice carried frustration, but not at Aisha, at the failure in the chain. He turned to the neighbor and told him sternly to be more careful in the future, reminding him that such mistakes put innocent people through unnecessary trauma. The neighbor nodded, ashamed, and left quietly. Now the room fell into a reflective silence. The female officer finally spoke. Her words were soft but sincere. "Ma'am, I know tonight shook your peace. I can't erase that, but I will carry this lesson forward. I hope you can believe me." Aisha looked at her and saw honesty in her eyes. She gave a small nod, but said nothing more. The supervisor then addressed Aisha directly, "You will receive a full written report within 48 hours. You will also receive an official apology from the department. Tonight, the body cameras recorded everything. That footage will be reviewed for training, so no one forgets what happened here." Aisha leaned back slowly, her blanket still wrapped around her. She felt the weight lifting slightly. She had seen panic in their eyes, but also resolve. The mistake was painful, but perhaps it could bring change. Before leaving, the supervisor asked gently, "Would you like additional patrol presence tonight to help you feel safer?" Aisha shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "What I want is not more officers. What I want is better officers." Her words were sharp but true. The supervisor nodded, accepting her answer. As the officers prepared to leave, the senior officer paused at the door. He looked back, his face heavy with regret. "Thank you for your patience tonight. We will not forget this." Then they stepped out, closing the door softly behind them. For the first time since the bath, Aisha's apartment was hers again. She stood in the quiet living room, her heart finally slowing. She thought of her father, likely reviewing every detail already, making sure promises became reality. She thought of the neighbor's trembling apology, of the female officer's sincere words, and of the supervisor's determined promises. She walked to the window again, looking at the city lights. They were steady, glowing, and endless, reminding her that life carried on outside her walls. But inside, something had shifted. She had faced intrusion, panic, and apology. And now, in the silence, she felt stronger. She knew tomorrow the story would not be over. Reports would be written, calls would be made, and her father's shadow would fall across every step of the investigation. The officers had left in panic, but they would wake tomorrow with a clearer mission. And Aisha, quietly standing by her window, knew she had turned her shock into a lesson they would never forget. The night after the officers left, Aisha's apartment was filled with silence. She sat alone on her couch, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The steam from her bath had long disappeared, but the tension in her chest had not. She replayed the entire evening in her mind, the pounding on the door, the boots on her floor, the cold shock of standing vulnerable in front of strangers. It felt like a memory she would never forget, even if time softened its edges. But as the hours passed, something else began to settle inside her, a strange mix of strength and clarity. She realized that while the event had shaken her, it had also revealed something important: people in positions of power could be held accountable, and mistakes could lead to changes that protected others. The next morning, a knock at her door pulled her from sleep. This time it was gentle, respectful, nothing like the storm of the night before. When she opened it, she found a uniformed messenger holding a sealed envelope. He introduced himself politely, handed it over, and left without lingering. Aisha closed the door, sat at her table, and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from the police department. It carried an official apology signed by the watch commander, along with a brief outline of the policy changes they had promised: mandatory double verification of addresses, callback procedures before forced entry, and clear steps to protect dignity in private spaces. There was also a note saying the full detailed report would follow within 2 days. Aisha read the letter slowly. She felt a small sense of relief that her words had been taken seriously. But she also knew these promises were just words on paper for now. She wanted to see if real action followed. Her father's voice echoed in her head: "People can say sorry, but true accountability shows in what they change afterward." Later that day, her phone rang again. It was her father. His voice was calm but firm, filled with the quiet authority that came naturally to him. He asked her to explain everything, step by step, in her own words. Aisha spoke slowly, describing the bath, the knocks, the door breaking, the panic, and finally the realization that the officers had acted on a mistaken call. She explained how the female officer had treated her with respect and how the supervisor had promised reforms. Her father listened silently, not interrupting once. When she finished, he said, "I'm proud of how you handled it. You stayed calm, you asked the right questions, and you demanded change. That's more powerful than anger." His words warmed her, but she could still hear the controlled steel in his tone. She knew he would make sure the promises were not forgotten. The following evening, Aisha attended a community forum held at the police precinct. She had been invited by the watch commander himself. She hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to face the officers again, but in the end, she decided to go. She wanted to see with her own eyes if they were serious about learning from the mistake. The forum room was filled with residents, officers, and community leaders. People spoke about their experiences, times when calls were mishandled, when misunderstandings had caused stress, when communication between dispatch and patrol had failed. Aisha listened carefully, realizing she was not alone. What happened to her was part of a larger problem. When it was her turn to speak, the room grew quiet. She stood up, her voice steady but clear. She told her story simply, without dramatics. She described the sound of boots in her living room while she stood in a towel, the embarrassment, the fear, and the realization that a small mistake in communication had led to a serious violation of her privacy. She didn't shout or accuse. She just told the truth. The room was silent when she finished. The watch commander stood and said, "This is exactly why we must change." He pointed to the new procedures already being drafted, and he admitted openly that what happened to Aisha was wrong. The officers in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably, but some nodded in agreement. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Aisha. One older woman patted her hand and whispered, "You spoke for all of us tonight." Another young man said, "What happened to you could have happened to anyone here. Thank you for making them listen." Aisha smiled softly. She realized her painful night had turned into something meaningful not just for her, but for many others. The following week, she received the full report in the mail. It detailed the chain of errors from the neighbor's call to dispatch's mistake, to the rushed decision by the officers. It outlined the training changes now being added, including a mandatory checklist for welfare calls. Reading it, Aisha felt a sense of closure. The mistake was recorded, the lessons were written down, and the changes had begun. As days turned into weeks, Aisha's apartment slowly returned to being her safe space again. She enjoyed her quiet evenings, sometimes sitting by the window with tea, looking at the city lights. She still felt a flicker of unease when she heard sudden knocks, but she was stronger now. She knew her voice had mattered. Her father never mentioned the incident in public. He didn't need to. But Aisha knew he was quietly watching to ensure the reforms were carried out. She knew the officers who had been there that night would never forget it either. For them, the memory of panic when they realized whose daughter they had startled would remain a lesson for life. In the end, Aisha carried away not just fear but also wisdom. Privacy must be protected as much as safety, and mistakes must lead to accountability. What began as a frightening night had turned into a story of change. And as she closed her eyes one evening, resting her head against the couch, she felt peace again, real peace, earned after the storm.